Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along to this event. Our speaker tonight is a sociologist who has taught a number of universities in England and elsewhere. He is the author of both the Mirth of Nations and the Right Joke, and so he has very strong academic credentials for talking about this topic this evening. But he is also, in fact, I suppose, a humour practitioner as well. In fact, he has starred alongside Eric Idle and Jermaine Greer in another a few years ago with the Cambridge Footnotes, and in fact he did so. And he also did so actually at the Oxford Playhouse. So he's been to Oxford a number of times, and he was also was it General Secretary of the Cambridge Union?
No, I was President.
President of the
General Secretary. I'm not Stalin.
Yes, so he was also President. So with that, I introduce our speaker for this evening, Christie Davies.
Thank you. Well, it's very kind of you to ask me back. I think it's the second time I've spoken to the Oxford Libertarian Society about jokes, and I'm quite happy to come back, even though you've now slid down to number 4 in the rankings. I don't mind. I mean, my university is number 2, but I'm not going to be condescending. I'm nice, really. I'm not going to give you an academic lecture. If you want to see the academic stuff and you want to read all the footnotes, the simple one, the Write a Joke, is up on the internet. If you simply put in Christie Davies, Write a Joke, it'll come up. It's on the Social Affairs unit. It's just a pamphlet. If you want the books, simply put in Christie Davies and then put in Amazon. All my books will come up, and you'll find there 4 books about humour, which are all academic footnote type books. One of them you may find a bit difficult because it's in Japanese, but the other 3 are straightforward. So whatever I say, I can back up, but I'm not going to bore you with going into all the academic detail. If you want to follow it up, you can find the books on Amazon, and you can get them out of the library or whatever you like. You might even get a cheap second-hand copy, God knows. But that's just a preamble. If anybody here feels they might be offended, please leave now. I'll give you a single penny in full and final compensation for your hurt feelings, but you have to go now. Don't say you weren't warned. The reason I say this is that last time I came and I gave a spiel about the Right to Joke, and I told various jokes, and at the end a woman jumped up, very offended, even though I had not mentioned this topic at all, and she said, "I am French." And I said, dommage. Meaning, what a pity. And she got even more offended at that point. And what puzzled me was I hadn't mentioned France at all. So she then continued in the kind of atrocious English that French people speak. And she went on to say, "Ever since I came to Oxford, because of the kind of jokes you have justified, everybody tries to pinch my bottom." And I thought, oh dear. And she then went on a great spiel about how in England everybody told jokes about the French and sex, and that therefore, once she'd arrived at Oxford, people thought that they had permission to grope her. And she kept saying, "Ever since I came here, I am experiencing the gropings." And I thought, this is weird. This woman has come from the country where l'arrière-pensée c'est derrière-pensée, and now she complains that she's having problems in Oxford. And I thought, she's crazy. And all she said was down to people telling jokes about the French and sex. And here there are some interesting fallacies that illustrate the politically correct mind. There's certain daft things that they think. The first is they don't seem to understand that jokes do not cause anything. They seem to think that jokes are a strong social force. They're not. I've studied now for 20 odd years to try and find out if jokes have any strong social effect. They don't. The sort of nonsense you get is, oh, they reinforce harmful stereotypes. That's the sort of line that you get. And you then get a lot of dodgy social psychologists who do experiments that consist of force-feeding people with jokes and then doing a tick-box questionnaire afterwards to see if their attitudes have changed. Half the time, you don't get any change, and the papers don't get published because they don't get any effect. This is the kind of distortion that you get in the academic world. The second thing you get is that they're doing a follow-up maybe an hour later, and you think, well, hold on a minute. Yes, there would be, but for a different reason. It's because jokes might prime something. In other words, if you've got an idea in your head, such as blondes are stupid, and somebody exposes you to a whole lot of blonde jokes, that primes a notion you already have. Although what's interesting is that half the people then react by behaving stupidly, and the other half behave in exactly the opposite way. So you get all these dodgy experiments where people say jokes have an effect. And it's not true. It's the other way round, that society is as it is, and the jokes are a mirror to that society. But this woman thought that people were trying to grab hold of her because jokes were being told in the society. I mean, just, it's an absurdity. The second aspect to it was, and again, a politically correct thing, which is really an inability to deal with factual information. That she never occurred to her to ask the question, well, where did the jokes come from? Why are there such jokes? And in fact, I went away afterwards, and the one benefit I got from her was that I then spent a lot of time trying to work out why the image existed with regard to the French and sex, and why it had been turned into humour. And what you find is that in the 18th century, it's because there's a singly dissolute court in France, and because England's a commercial society. And so you get an antithesis. Now, what has that got to do with the jokes? Nothing. What it has to do with is a difference in social order. In the 19th century, what it's about is the French do very well indeed out of sex tourism. France is the first country to encourage sex tourism. That people go to France to get sex, to get commercial sex. A very good example is Leo Apsey, who was a noted British Member of Parliament, who actually told us at great length in his memoirs how he'd gone to France at the age of 17 as a representative of the Young Socialists to Paris, precisely in order to avail himself of French commercial sex. And this was absolutely standard stuff. And the third one, in the 20th century, and in fact goes back a bit earlier, is that the French have a remarkable habit of their country being occupied. Right? This is something they make a habit of. It happened in 1870, happened in 1914, happened in 1940, and then they have to get the Anglo-Saxons to dig them out of it. So there's a British army goes there in 1914, 1918, it goes there again in 39-40, it goes there again in 1944. Now, what happens with armies? Armies have camp followers. And the camp followers in this case were French, and again, this is where the idea comes from. It's nothing to do with jokes, it has to do with historical experience. And I don't think anyone can disagree with the fact that France has been regularly occupied. I mean, if you go there, you sort of look at the roads, and everywhere there's nice, have you noticed the nice shady trees at the sides of roads in France? Do you know why they're there? It's so the German army can march in the shade. I think that is how it is. I mean, the whole of the historical pressure is in this direction, and this is where the jokes come from. It's not that the jokes cause reality, reality leads to the jokes. That's a very important point, and you can't get the PC people to see that. They somehow think that jokes have a power. And I suspect one of the reasons is if you look at the people who subscribe to a PC ideology, they're scribblers. They're people who write little ideological tracts that they're quite convinced they're going to transform the world, and they're not. And because they believe in their own power to affect the world through words, they assume that words have a kind of superpower, which is a way of flattering themselves. Therefore, they argue, why is the world bad? It's because of other people's words, and jokes are an example of this. And it's all total nonsense. But I now want to go back before the era of political correctness, and I want to talk about what was my formative time when there was a jolly thing called the Cold War. And during the Cold War, I used to regularly rouse with the proto-PC people. And also I used to regularly go to Eastern Europe. And what you found during the Cold War was you got the PC people making the same kinds of noises. They would say things like, we must try and see the Soviet Union's point of view. And I would say, why? I say, I want to understand the Soviet Union, but only in order to defeat it. And this is one of the problems with PC people, that they want to understand an opponent and they confuse it with sympathise. Do you follow me? I want to understand those people in order to destroy them. They wanted to understand them because they wanted to sympathise with them. That's a very big PC confusion. Another one they come out with is they say, oh, we mustn't stigmatise the Soviet Union. And I would say, why not? It's evil. But the PC people, anything that's wrong or any group in the society that causes a problem, oh, we mustn't stigmatise them. And again, this has a lot to do with the kinds of things they don't want people to joke about. Another one was equivalence. That if there was any great evil in the Soviet Union, they'd find some small fault in our own society and they then compare the two. So that there weren't any fair trials in the Soviet Union. You point this out and they say, oh, here's a particular case of an unfair trial in this country. Do you get me? That was always the same pattern of argumentation. And the other thing that they didn't like, and this is quite relevant to the PC stuff now. As an academic, one of the things that struck me was the extent to which you were vulnerable to being persecuted by the PC people. That if you wanted to move to another job or if you wanted to get a promotion, they had the power to block it. But during the Cold War, it was always an argument the other way around, that if you pointed out that somebody held quite repellent left-wing political views, they'd scream McCarthyism. And I can remember this in a case in Leeds where I was critical of the Professor of Economics, who was a strident communist. And I said, look, if you ask me, that guy's an agent. He works with the Soviet Union. Then there'd be a great hoo-ha. How can you possibly criticise a respected Marxist academic? When they opened the KGB files, my Leeds colleague was found to be in the files, and he had been an agent. He'd been working for them all along. But that was considered, oh, you mustn't attack people on those grounds. Now ask yourself the question today, if, for example, somebody were to be accused of being un-PC, right, would it harm them or not? The answer is that in that context it would do them a lot of harm. Whereas before, you could be an out-and-out supporter of the Soviet Union, an evil dictatorship, and you were untouchable. Anyway, it was the same then as it is now. And I then started going regularly to Eastern Europe. And what I would do is I would get a grant to go and study some aspect of humour in Eastern Europe. So, for example, I went to the Czech Republic to study the Good Soldier Schweik. And my times were divided between the day, when I did my official academic work, and my evenings when I would meet dissidents and we would exchange anecdotes, as they were called. That is to say, jokes about the regimes. And it was interesting the way in which one had to do that you could not tell the jokes openly. And I can remember sitting with people in a public place when they were telling jokes about Brezhnev. He was always referred to in the jokes as Mr. B. And why? Well, because we're telling jokes in English. And people around us can't understand what we're saying. But supposing you keep saying, Brezhnev, and everybody falls apart laughing, there will be somebody who will be there who will in effect be an informer. That isn't matter to me particularly. The worst thing that is I can get chucked out of the country, but it caused problems for the others. And so they would insist on this. Now, one of the things that has struck me about the PC people in this country is they are encouraging people to be informers. They encourage you to be an informer. And I'll give you an example of this. And this was the Conservative MP Anne Winterton, who was at a private gathering, and she told a joke at a time when a whole lot of Chinese cockle pickers had been drowned in Morecambe. People ever remember this? It was a particular disaster, where what happens is that the sands are very flat in Morecambe. The Chinese were being paid very small sums of money to go out and get cockles. Probably some gang is running it. Tide came in quickly and they all got drowned. Someone didn't like that joke. Oh, it's probably the Bullingdon Club. You know, hold on.
I want to stand away from the windows.
Hold on. Can you hear Cameron? Anyway, the joke that she told was that there were two sharks who were swimming in the Irish Sea, and one says to the other one, you know, it's pretty boring round here. There's nothing but tuna. And the other shark says, oh, I'll tell you what, let's go to Morecambe and have a Chinese. Now, okay, it's not a joke in the best of taste, but it was told in a private setting. What happened? There was an informer present, and the informer promptly was on the phone to get her suspended from the parliamentary party. And that's the sort of thing that goes on. You never know that there isn't a Guardian reader somewhere. And that these people have got a mobile phone in their pocket, and they'll say, excuse me, I've got to go out for a pee, and the next thing you know, they've grassed you up to somebody. That is the PC mentality. And I've seen it happen in a whole lot of contexts. And it reminds me horribly of what Eastern Europe used to be like. And people often say to me, did the jokes in Eastern Europe have any effect? And again, I've spent a lot of time studying it, and I decided no. And I was asked this again after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union is probably one of the most exciting events in my lifetime. I was actually present in Bulgaria when socialism collapsed. And I've rarely had such a wonderful feeling in my life. I could see socialism collapsing as I watched. And literally, I was able to dance on the tomb of Dimitrov. And I watched as the officials came out of the ministry and the crowd were shouting and booing, and they could not do anything. You could see that their power had gone away. And we shouted abuse them in English, and we sang songs about socialism. And of course, some of the more senior people could speak English. I've never seen people more angry in my life. They knew that the end had come as far as they were concerned. It was absolutely a wonderful feeling. I had seen the collapse of what was then the ideal of the proto-PC people. I'd seen it crumble away. But if you then say to me, what part did jokes play? And you then say to people who are experts on how regimes collapse, give me the top 20 reasons why you think it happened. Jokes won't make the top 20. That is the key to deciding what the power of something is after the event. That you say to people, without giving them an idea, you say to them, give me a list of the most important things. But you don't hint at them. You don't say to them, how important do you think jokes were? You don't do that. What you do is, you simply ask them the cold question, give me the top 10. Jokes don't make it. Jokes have no power. And it's this looking backwards is the way in which you can tell cause and effect. You can't do it forwards. That's too sort of stupid speculation. So why then were the jokes important? If they had no effect, why were they important? The reason were they important was that they frustrated hegemony. That's the key reason. That in a sense they preserved people's autonomy in a world where there was a single dominant ideology, which is only possible under socialism. Because only under socialism all the institutions controlled properly from the centre. And that was what was important about it. They kept alive in people's minds the idea that things could be different. The idea that they don't have to be like this. And I'll give you a couple of examples that were favourites of mine that were told at the time, and I'll explain why they damaged this hegemony so much. And what is important to realise is this, is that it's not jokes about contemporary politicians like Brezhnev that were important. What is far more important is if you look at the ones that go deeper and which make fun of the myths and the ideology of the system. That's the important one. I'll give you an example that there's an Orthodox priest has died and he goes up to heaven. And they say to him, well, before we admit you to heaven, have you got one last wish before you come in? He said, yes. He said, I'd like to be taken on a guided tour of hell by Virgil. So they say, yeah, no problem at all. You can go on this tour. So he goes round and he comes to one of the deeper pits of hell. And there are Hitler and Stalin in a lake of boiling shit. And Hitler's in it up to his nose, and Stalin's in it up to his waist. And the priest says to his guide, he said, what's this about? He said, Stalin was every bit as evil as Hitler. He said, I suffered under both of them. He said, how come Stalin's in it only up to his waist and Hitler's in it right up to his nose? And the guy said, you don't understand. Stalin is standing on Lenin's shoulders. Now, you say, well, why is that joke important? It's important because it ties together several ideas. The first one is it makes an equivalence between Hitler and Stalin. Right? That is absolutely deadly from the point of view of the regime. Because what you find, and you get it again today, is if you meet people who go around shouting that they are, quote, anti-fascists, you can bet your life they're fascists. Their mentality will be exactly the same as the people they're shouting against. And that was the same as between Hitler and Stalin. It was the same, and the jokes made it clear it was the same. And you can imagine how much that got the ideologues of the system angry. The second thing is it knocks another myth. The myth that the evils of socialism was simply due to particular bad individuals. And so what had happened in the Soviet Union was after Stalin died, they built up the cult of Lenin and the idea, if only we could go back to Leninism, then it would have been okay. And what they're doing is they're reviving a slogan of Stalin's, that he is standing on the shoulders of Lenin. But they're also making it clear there's total continuity between Lenin and Stalin. Do you see the point? So in one joke they've encapsulated everything about the ideology. And you can see that even though the jokes played no part in overthrowing the system, they kept alive the idea we don't have to think the way the people in charge of the system think. That was what was important about it. And when I would say to people in Eastern Europe, I'd say, well, why on earth don't you have freedom of speech in this place? What would be the problem? They always give you the same answer. They would say, but if we had freedom of speech, that would lead to the inequalities of a bourgeois society. Right? It's exactly the same line you get with the PC people. That if you say to them, why can't we have freedom of speech? Why do we have to put up with your rubbish? They'll come up with a line about equality. Or they like the phrase social justice. There's nothing like the word social for undermining the meaning of something. A social democrat is not a democrat. A social worker is not a worker. And social justice is not justice. In fact, they're almost the opposite. If you want to turn a word around, put social in front of it. And what you want to do when you confront the PC people is don't ever accept their terms of argument. Right? Don't say, yes, well, they must be good people because they believe in equality. Always remember that most tyrannies have been based on the drive towards equality. If you look at the Soviet Union, you look at Mao's China, you look at Pol Pot, all are about the drive to equality. And I noticed that one of Obama's advisors has recently been in trouble for saying that one of the great political thinkers whom she admired is Mao Zedong. And then people said to her, well, he did murder 100 million people. And her reply was, yes, but he was a great egalitarian. And he showed that you can transform society in an egalitarian direction. That's how PC people think. And every so often they'll give it away. And these are basically people who are left over from the Cold War period. They had to find something else. Now, in our society, the hegemony is partial. But I still think we have a duty to resist it. I'm not saying it's simply a right to be against it, but it's a duty to be against it. It wouldn't matter what kind of hegemony it was, you should be against it. It just happens that it is the PC one. And it may be partial, and it may occur in particular institutions. Pretty clearly it prevails in universities, for example. It prevails in broadcasting. And what one has to do is to defy it. But you can't defy it openly very easily. Jokes are a way of saying, look, we haven't been taken in by your nonsense. And one particular occasion, which really annoyed the PC people, was, this may be before your people's time, do you remember the death of Diana? Or were you born then? Anyway, I'll remind you anyway. Princess Diana was a worthless little trollop whom Prince Charles, more generally known as Big Ears, happened to be married to. And it was a total disaster. Anyway, the marriage broke up. And she took up with the Muslim fancy man, one of several fancy men she took up with, called Dodi Al-Fayed. And they went off to Paris, and they hired a drunken driver. Well, most French are drunken drivers, there's nothing unusual about that. Henri Paul, or Paul, however the wretched people say it. And anyway, he drove into a wall, and she and Dodi Al-Fayed were killed. And everybody was supposed to feel distress about this. And my attitude was, well, you're probably, how many people get killed by drunken drivers in France in a year? 500,000. Anyway, it's a fair number. Why should I feel particularly upset about this one? Why should everybody be expected to go into mourning at the death of this woman? And it's interesting that the subsequent studies have shown, when they've done interview studies, a lot of people felt that. But television said, no, everybody's got to go into mourning. Everybody's got to feel grief. I didn't feel any grief at all. None whatsoever. And I remember that all the other people started inventing jokes. For example, what did the mortuary attendant say when he was putting Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed into body bags? Zippity Dodi, zippity die. Ah yes, it's the way he tells them. And you say, well, what was good about the jokes? It was that they defied the hegemony that television tried to impose on people. They defied Tony Blair. Because at the time, Anthony O'Hare wrote a piece in which he attacked what he called the sentimentalisation of Britain, and a very scholarly piece, saying, look, you know, what is all this whinging and keening about when really it's unimportant? And Tony Blair actually broke off a meeting in Saudi in order to denounce Anthony O'Hare. Now that, you know, you think about it, the whole thing's becoming politicised. And then Tony Blair, of course, exploited it politically, just as he exploited everything else politically. And my feeling was, no, that what the jokes are, it's not that they're going to have any effect on anything, but the jokes are a way of saying, I'm not going along with this. That's the importance of the jokes. Anyway, let me come on to a more recent one, and this is a story, Gay Hate Jokes Get Banned. Here we have a piece of legislation. It's just gone through the Commons, probably isn't in law yet, but I'm going to break it anyway. And it basically, in theory, it's about stirring up hatred, but it would seem is going to apply to jokes. And in fact, the Blackadder star Rowan Atkinson has protested about this, just as he protested earlier when they wanted to have a similar ruling in regard to religion. Now, what is the importance of this? The importance of this is that one has to defy bans of this kind, because otherwise there's this assumption everybody agrees. I don't agree, and I hope you don't agree, that the power of the state should be used in this way. And here there's a curious turnaround over time, that as a libertarian I've been defending the Puritans for 30 years. My first ever publication was an attack on a man who's thankfully now forgotten, Porthery Devlin, who wrote an article saying, and this is very PC indeed, that it was okay to subject them to criminal prosecutions if reasonable people had a sense of indignation and disgust about them. Now I felt, well, as a libertarian, you can't have that. That is not a good reason for having a law. But this is now what the PC people want the other way around. And you suddenly think, well, what goes on? And I can remember when there was a prosecution of a man called Moon for publishing in a homosexual periodical a poem by a man called James Kirkup. And he was prosecuted, and initially, in fact, they were going to send him to jail because they said the poem was blasphemous. And I have to say, it was a fairly disgusting poem. It was about a Roman soldier who's looking at Jesus on the cross at the time of the crucifixion and thinking, well, wouldn't it be fun to have it off with Jesus? Not a very nice poem, but nonetheless, if you're a libertarian, then you uphold the right of people to do these things. And I can remember sending a cheque to the Defence Fund to try and get him off. And now suddenly I find myself on the opposite side of the argument. I find myself having to defend the liberty of the Bishop of Chester. Now, the Bishop of Chester said that he thought homosexuals should go and see psychiatrists to be cured of their homosexuality, which is a very stupid thing to say, but then bishops are stupid. They're not all quite as stupid as Rowan Williams, but nonetheless most of them are pretty dim. And the next thing we find is that the Chief Constable of Cheshire, called Fahey, has sent somebody round to question the Bishop of Chester with a view to prosecuting him. Now at this point I thought, hold on, as a libertarian, who do I defend? And the answer is I defend the Bishop of Chester. And I think now that it's gone further, that we have a duty to tell jokes about gays, not because we're against them, but in order to defy a new restrictive and pointless law. And people then say, oh, if you tell such things, that means you must hate them. No, I don't hate them in any way. I can point to a 30-year record of writing articles defending them and defending their liberty. I don't hate them at all. What I do hate is people who read The Guardian. I mean, that one I'm prepared to plead guilty to. I have no feelings at all about the gays, and whatever they get up to, that's fine by me. But I do not want to have to go along with Guardian speak. And I know what will happen. I can tell you now exactly what will happen, because I've seen it happen before. They'll put the word hatred into a bill, and you think, oh, well, that can't be too bad. We shouldn't hate people. I mean, I don't really even hate Guardian readers. I mean, I may despise them, but I don't really hate them. I mean, I don't wake up in the middle of the night feeling I could strangle a Guardian reader. I mean, I've even, going into London on the train, and you see sort of hordes of people with their noses in the Guardian. And at times, I have to admit, it's tempting to walk down a train and mash all the newspapers in as you go past. But I've never actually done it. But the problem is this, is that once you get the word hatred being used, the next thing you know is it gets expanded. And it gets expanded to mean mockery, or it gets expanded to mean criticism. And that's where the real problem comes. And here, of course, we have a whole industry of people who have an interest in expanding the meanings of those words. And I don't actually think that you need to have a law with that word hatred in it. There are perfectly good laws against incitement. Right? That already existed where you can stop people preaching hatred. And what is also worrying about this preaching hatred business is that some people are allowed to go on preaching hatred. The law is applied selectively. So if I happen to be a Muslim nutter and I were to preach hatred of homosexuals, I could do it with impunity. No one would ever dare touch me. In other words, this is the other problem with the PC business. It's not a question of who says something. It's not a question of the effect of what is being said. It's a question of who is doing the saying. And that's what defines your vulnerability in the face of laws of this kind. And I suspect that what they will go for is they won't go for people who really hate homosexuals, of whom there are a large number. I don't deny that. What they will go for, people like Roy Chubby Brown, do you know who I mean? The northeastern comedian who basically makes a living telling jokes about queer. And I'll tell you a Roy Chubby Brown joke. And this is a typical joke of the kind that they will now try and pounce on. Anyway, there's a bunch of labourers who are digging a hole in the street. And there they are, a great big muscular bronze chaps, they're all stripped to the weight, they're digging a ditch. And the little chap comes along with an umbrella. And he looks at them and he thinks, oh, I would like to have sex with one of them. So he goes up to them and he says, let's be friends. And the chap says, clear off. Oh no, let's be friends. Clear off! Now, let's be friends. Listen, mate, if you don't go away, I'll ram your umbrella up your arse. Oh, no. Do let's be friends. Come on. Anyway, chap grabs a chap's umbrella and rams it up his arse. And the little chap says, oh, now open it slowly. Now, what will happen is, if I were to tell that joke in a year's time, I'd probably get prosecuted. They would come along to the Oxford Libertarian Society and say, you have been preaching hatred under section 14, subsection 2 of the Protection of Queers Act of 2010. And what I'm saying to you is, it should not be like that. That not only should we have the right to tell that joke, and I admit it wasn't a very good joke, but it's our duty to tell such jokes, because it is our duty to defy the use of the power of the state to try and shape and determine how we think. Right, well, I think that's most of what I want to say at this point. Oh, I'll just give you one more example of how totally obsessional the PC people are, and of how the system of informers works. And this is a story about the council in Edinburgh. And what happened, it says here, I'll read it out. It says, a council worker is facing the sack after being caught searching the internet for sick jokes about the Asian tsunami. An investigation has been launched after the operator of an internet blog site complained to the city council. The operator said his site, which contains a variety of news items and internet funnies, received a hit from someone at this authority, that is to say somebody working for the council, who had used the Yahoo search engine to look for the tsunami joke. Council officials believe it could take days to identify the individual involved, as they have more than 20,000 employees. BT, which administers the council's web service, is believed to be helping with the investigation. Now, what is this about? The first thing is, it can't be about people wasting time at work. All people who work for the government waste time at work most of the time. People who work for a Scottish council are particularly likely to be wasting time at work. I mean, what does it matter whether they're looking up something on the internet or whether they're doing crossword puzzles? I mean, even if they're doing what they're paid to do, is useless anyway. No, that wasn't what it was about. What it was about, it was the politically correct brigade who are prepared to put into action a witch hunt among 20,000 people to find somebody who looked up this joke on the internet in order to sack him. Now, I don't know what happened in the end, I mean, whether they caught the person or not, but that is the kind of obsessiveness that goes on within the PC world. And part of why we should tell jokes that defy that world is because it has become intrusive and oppressive. Yeah? Well, I'll give you plenty of time to ask questions.
Thank you. Thank you.